The birthday that broke everything. Natalie Reed had always believed birthdays were meant to be beginnings, not endings. The sun had risen that morning on the kind of California day that seemed impossible to ruin. The sky was the soft blue of calm seas. The air carried a scent of orange blossoms, and in her living room stood the man she thought she would spend the rest of her life with. Grant Whitmore III, venture capital golden boy, philanthropist on magazine covers, the man who had slipped an engagement ring on her finger and whispered promises of forever. They had met 3 years earlier at a charity gala when she was running the marketing campaign that raised a record $10 million for childhood education. He had walked up to her afterward and said, "You don't belong behind the scenes. You're the story." From that moment she had believed him, built her world around the confidence he projected. Even when he was late to dinners, distracted during conversations, or dismissive about her small victories, she had told herself it was stress, business, pressure. Not betrayal. Never betrayal. That evening was supposed to mark the happiest turning point of her life. Her 32nd birthday, 6 months pregnant with their first child, surrounded by friends, family, and every glittering promise of the future. The private dining room of the Whitmore Hotel gleamed with gold-trimmed chandeliers and crystal glasses catching the light like tiny suns. Natalie's best friend Brooke had organized everything, the cake, the playlist, the guest list, with her usual efficiency and warmth. Brooke had been her roommate in college, maid of honor in waiting, the person she trusted more than anyone else. When Grant arrived, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, Natalie's heart lifted. He smiled that perfect public relations smile, and for one beautiful, foolish second she thought he might finally be fully present. When the champagne cork popped and the crowd began to sing, she felt her baby kick in a tiny flutter of life, a reminder that joy could still live in her, even when the world felt fragile. Then Grant stepped forward, reached into his jacket, and everything slowed. Cameras lifted, phones came out, guests leaned in with soft gasps. Natalie felt her cheeks flush as she placed her hand on her belly, half laughing, half trembling. "Oh God," she whispered to Brooke. "He's actually doing it tonight." Brooke blinked, unsure, her smile flickering like a candle in wind. Grant dropped to one knee, but not in front of Natalie. He turned slightly, angled toward Brooke, holding out a box that glowed with an emerald ring. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. The pianist stopped mid-note. The waiter holding the champagne tray froze. Natalie heard only the ringing in her ears, the kind that comes when reality breaks sound itself. Her brain refused to compute what her eyes saw. Her fiancé kneeling in front of her best friend, his voice steady, rehearsed, confident as ever. "Brooke Taylor," he said, "you are the woman I want beside me for the rest of my life." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a confused gasp, a disbelieving whisper. Brooke's face went pale, her lips parted in horror. "Grant, what are you doing?" she stammered. But Grant only smiled wider, as though this were a romantic plot twist and not a public act of emotional violence. Natalie's knees gave way and someone, her mother maybe, caught her arm before she hit the floor. The air disappeared from the room. The music stopped. The applause that should have followed such a moment never came. Grant straightened, sliding the ring back into his pocket as if he had merely offered a toast gone wrong. "I suppose that's a no," he said lightly, his charm cracking at the edges. "Let's all calm down. It's not what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. Natalie's mother's face went rigid with disbelief. Eleanor Whitmore, Grant's own mother, turned away as though she could erase the scene. Brooke stood rooted to the spot, tears pooling in her eyes, shaking her head over and over. "Natalie, I swear I didn't know," she whispered, but Natalie couldn't process the words. All she could think was how could he? How could he choose this moment, this day, this way to shatter her? She heard chairs scraping back, guests leaving in uncomfortable silence, the sound of champagne glasses clinking like tiny shards of judgment. Grant kept talking, trying to spin the disaster, claiming that he had misunderstood his own heart, that he and Brooke had connected on some deeper level, that he would always support Natalie and the baby. His words blurred together into white noise. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Her throat burned with humiliation. Somewhere in the chaos, Brooke ran out crying, and Natalie found herself standing alone beside the untouched cake, the candles melting into wax puddles. When the last guest was gone, Eleanor Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, pearls gleaming like armor. She looked up as Natalie walked past and said quietly, "I raised him better than this." Her voice was brittle, the voice of a woman who had seen this story before and still hoped for a different ending. Natalie wanted to scream, to throw something, to tear the expensive roses from their vases. Instead, she stood frozen, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the back of a chair for balance. "I don't even recognize him," she whispered. "You're not alone," Eleanor replied. "You have me, and you have that child. That's where we start." Outside, the night air was cold against Natalie's flushed skin. She didn't remember walking to the car, didn't remember Eleanor taking the keys from her trembling hand. The city blurred through her tears, light smearing into color streaks like watercolor bleeding on wet paper. In the passenger seat, she pressed her palms against her stomach, whispering, we're okay, but nothing felt okay. Inside the car, Eleanor drove in silence until they reached Natalie's apartment. "You should know," she said softly. "Men like Grant, they plan everything. Even this." Natalie turned to her in disbelief. "You think he planned to humiliate me?" Eleanor's mouth tightened. "Not humiliation, control. He wanted to make you desperate enough to stay on his terms. He miscalculated. He forgot who you are." In her penthouse, the scent of Grant's cologne still lingered, sharp and expensive. His jacket hung on the hook by the door. His cufflinks lay on the counter, his world invading hers even in absence. She walked through the rooms as if through a museum of betrayal. The framed ultrasound photo, the half-packed hospital bag, the pair of champagne glasses engraved G&N forever. Each object became evidence of a lie. She sat on the couch and finally let herself break, sobbing into her hands until the sound filled the empty apartment like a storm. Eleanor sat across from her, silent witness, offering no false comfort. When the crying subsided, Eleanor spoke in a tone that was both gentle and steel-edged. "You can let this define you," she said, "or you can let it refine you. He expects you to disappear, to fall apart so he can paint himself the victim. Don't give him that satisfaction." Natalie lifted her head, eyes swollen but fierce. "What do I do?" she asked. "You fight back," Eleanor said simply. "But first you rest. You gather your strength. You remember who you were before him." Those words settled in her like seeds finding soil. For the first time that night, she felt something other than despair, a flicker of determination, small but alive. She realized that the life she thought she had built with Grant was gone, but the life she could build without him had just begun. She wasn't ready to forgive, not ready to plan revenge, not ready to move on, but she was ready to stand. That night, she packed his clothes into suitcases one by one, each fold deliberate, each movement a quiet declaration that this space, this future now belonged to her and the child she carried. When she was done, she opened the balcony door, letting the night breeze sweep through the apartment. The city lights stretched before her like possibilities she had never considered. Her hands rested on her belly again, feeling the faint movement of the baby within, proof that even after devastation, life insists on continuing. Natalie whispered, "We're going to be okay." And for the first time, she almost believed it. The war begins the next morning. Sunlight streamed through the curtains of Natalie's apartment, cutting across the chaos of last night like a spotlight revealing the wreckage. Empty glasses from the party still sat on the counter. Her phone vibrated nonstop with unanswered messages, and the once beautiful flowers Brooke had sent earlier that week now looked wilted, lifeless, symbolic. She stood at the center of it all, barefoot in her robe, staring at the diamond ring on her hand, or what used to be a symbol of love, loyalty, and shared dreams. Now it was just a cold reminder of how easily promises could turn to ash. Slowly she slipped it off, placed it in an envelope, and wrote in sharp black ink across the front, "Return to sender." That small gesture, so simple yet so final, made her heart pound harder than the entire confrontation last night. She felt something inside her shift, something small but solid, like the first brick being laid in the foundation of a new life. Eleanor Whitmore arrived not long after, elegant as ever in her pale beige suit, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folder under her arm. "You didn't sleep," she observed calmly as she looked at Natalie's tired eyes. "No," Natalie said. "I kept thinking it was a nightmare I'd wake up from, but it wasn't." Eleanor placed the folder on the counter and gestured for her to sit. "Then it's time to stop crying and start strategizing." Grant may have humiliated you publicly, but he hasn't finished. Men like my son never stop until they've destroyed the thing they can't control. And right now that's you." Natalie frowned, her mind foggy with exhaustion. "He's the father of my child. I don't want a war." Eleanor gave a small, humorless smile. "You already have one, dear. The question is whether you're going to fight it or lose it." Inside the folder were documents, bank statements, real estate holdings, trust accounts, all proof of Grant's financial empire. Eleanor had clearly come prepared. "He's transferred assets into offshore accounts over the last 6 months," she explained. "That suggests he knew this breakup was coming. Probably planned it before you even announced the pregnancy. He'll try to claim the child for status, for image, to preserve his reputation. You'll need a lawyer before noon." Natalie's mind reeled. "You're helping me against your own son?" Eleanor's expression softened, but her voice stayed firm. "I'm helping my granddaughter. Grant made his choices. This family doesn't reward cruelty." By the afternoon, Natalie found herself sitting in a law office downtown, the air smelling of leather and ambition. Marcus Albright, a calm and confident attorney recommended by Eleanor, listened to her story without interrupting. When she finished, he folded his hands. "You're in a stronger position than you realize," he said. "Pregnancy gives you certain legal protections, but we'll need to move fast. We'll file for full custody preemptively, and we'll lock down any joint accounts before he drains them." Natalie nodded numbly, each step feeling surreal, like she was watching another woman's life unfold. "I just wanted to be a mother," she murmured. "Not someone's opponent." Marcus leaned forward. "You can be both. But remember this. You're not fighting him for revenge, you're fighting for your child's peace. That's what makes you unstoppable." That night, Natalie sat in her kitchen with Eleanor and her own mother, Patricia, surrounded by papers, plans, and the remnants of takeout dinner. The two older women, one soft and nurturing, the other sharp and commanding, seemed to balance each other perfectly. Patricia had been the heart Natalie leaned on her whole life, while Eleanor, surprisingly, had become the strategist she never knew she needed. "You'll rebuild," Patricia said gently, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Maybe not the same way, but better." Eleanor nodded. "Rebuilding is fine, but first, she needs to protect what's hers." The conversation stretched late into the night. Finances, legal filings, hospital preparations, and through it all, Natalie felt her fear start to transform into something steadier. Not anger, not vengeance, but focus. The following days became a blur of motion. Natalie resigned from her position at the marketing firm, a move that stunned her colleagues but freed her from the corporate environment Grant had quietly influenced. With Marcus's help, she opened her own consulting agency from her apartment, calling it Reed Marketing Solutions. The first clients came from recommendations by people who respected her work long before she was known as Grant Whitmore's fiancée. Each email that came through, each small payment that landed in her account, felt like a breath of independence. Her baby bump grew, her determination grew with it, and with every sleepless night she discovered a version of herself she had never met before, a version that didn't need anyone's permission to exist. Grant, meanwhile, did exactly what Eleanor predicted. He began contacting her through lawyers, accusing her of emotional instability, demanding access to medical records, and claiming she was using the pregnancy to manipulate him. The audacity might have broken her once, but not now. Marcus's firm responded swiftly, dismantling every false claim with documentation and witness testimony. Eleanor's influence behind the scenes was undeniable. Every attempt Grant made to intimidate Natalie seemed to backfire. The press, which had once adored him, began whispering about his behavior. "He underestimated you," Marcus said one afternoon after another successful court response. "He thought you'd hide. You stood up instead. That's what terrifies men like him." But victory wasn't without pain. There were nights when Natalie lay awake, listening to the city hum outside her window, wondering if her daughter would grow up asking why her father wasn't around. She didn't hate Grant. She hated what he had chosen to become. There was a difference, and understanding that difference was what kept her from becoming bitter. Every morning she wrote in a small journal letters to her unborn daughter. "Today, you kicked when I drank orange juice. Today, I signed papers to protect your future. Today, I realized love shouldn't hurt this much." Writing became therapy, a private ritual of healing that allowed her to transform pain into purpose. 3 weeks later, she met Brooke for the first time since that night. It happened unexpectedly. Brooke showed up at her building, pale, thinner, eyes rimmed with guilt. "Please, Nat," she said, voice trembling. "Let me explain." Every instinct in Natalie's body screamed to shut the door, but something in Brooke's face stopped her. They sat in the lobby cafe, the silence heavy between them. Brooke's story came out in fragments. How Grant had manipulated her, how he'd convinced her Natalie had been unfaithful, how he had dangled promises of marriage and stability when she was at her lowest. "He used us both," Brooke said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't even realize how deep I'd fallen until that night." Natalie listened quietly. For a long time she said nothing. Then she whispered, "You made a choice, Brooke. But so did I. I choose to move forward." She stood, left a few bills on the table, and walked away, not in anger, but in peace. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant freedom. By her 8th month, Natalie had transformed from the humiliated woman at that dinner to a force no one could ignore. Her business had 5 clients. Her savings were stable, and her confidence returned in full measure. She attended her final court hearing flanked by Marcus and Eleanor, wearing a simple navy dress that made her look calm, professional, unshakable. Grant sat on the other side of the courtroom, still handsome, still arrogant, but now visibly nervous. The judge reviewed the evidence, the character statements, the financial reports. When the decision came down granting Natalie full custody until birth and primary guardianship thereafter, Grant's composure cracked for the first time. He muttered something under his breath that Natalie didn't catch. She didn't need to. The gavel came down and the sound echoed through the courtroom like the end of an era. When it was over, Eleanor hugged her tightly. "He'll try again," she said, "but you'll be ready." Natalie smiled faintly. "He can try all he wants. I'm not the same woman he left standing in that restaurant." Eleanor nodded. "No, you're stronger." That evening, Natalie returned home, her body aching but her spirit lighter than it had been in months. She stood on her balcony again, the city alive below her. Somewhere in that skyline was the life she had thought she wanted. The mansion, the charity galas, the perfect image. But what she had now was something deeper: authenticity, resilience, self-respect. As the wind brushed against her face, she whispered, "We're almost there, little one. The worst is over." Inside, on her dining table, sat a single unopened envelope, an invitation to another Whitmore charity event. She smiled at it, not with nostalgia but with closure. That world was behind her now. Tomorrow would be the first day of the rest of her life. Not as someone's fiancée, but as herself. The birth of strength. The night her labor began, Los Angeles was drenched in rain, the kind of heavy storm that made the whole city seem to hold its breath. Natalie had spent the evening finishing a client proposal from her laptop, surrounded by the quiet hum of her small but thriving business. The rhythmic tapping of keys was almost comforting, a reminder that she had rebuilt something meaningful from the ruins of her former life. When the first contraction struck, sharp and low, she thought it was just another ache of late pregnancy. But when the next one came 5 minutes later, stronger, deeper, undeniable, her breath caught. She set her laptop aside, placed a hand on her belly, and whispered, "Okay, little one, I think it's time." There was fear in her voice, yes, but also a strange calmness. She had survived public humiliation, endless legal battles, nights of loneliness so heavy they pressed against her ribs. And now she was about to meet the person who had made all of it worth enduring. Patricia was the first to arrive, her motherly instincts sharpened by decades of experience. Within minutes, she had the hospital bag ready, the car running, and a reassuring hand on Natalie's shoulder. "Breathe," she said gently. "You've done harder things." Eleanor met them at the hospital, pearls traded for a simple wool coat, her face lined with both worry and pride. The nurses recognized the last name Whitmore and treated Natalie with the politeness reserved for social elites. But Natalie no longer cared for such recognition. She was not here as anyone's fiancée or extension of wealth. She was here as a mother. The hours that followed blurred into a storm of pain, sweat, and determination. Each contraction tore through her body, but every time she felt like surrendering, she remembered why she couldn't. The tiny heartbeat that had kept her going through betrayal. The fluttering life that had given her purpose when everything else had crumbled. She gripped Eleanor's hand once, her mother's the next. alternating between their strength as if drawing energy from both generations. "You're almost there," the doctor said finally, voice steady amid the chaos, and then with one last cry, the world split open and filled with sound. A newborn's cry, raw and perfect. The first proof that pain could create miracles. They placed the baby on her chest, warm and slick and small beyond belief. Natalie's tears came without control, a flood of emotion that washed away months of anger and exhaustion. "She's beautiful," Patricia whispered, voice breaking. "Maya," Natalie said softly, naming the child she had already named in her heart. "Her name is Maya." The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around her mother's thumb, and in that instant Natalie felt something shift inside her forever. It wasn't just love. It was an awakening. All the strength she had borrowed, all the courage she had faked, suddenly became real because now there was someone who depended on her entirely. Grant appeared at the hospital 12 hours later. He looked smaller somehow, less invincible in the sterile light of the maternity ward. A bouquet of lilies hung awkwardly from his hand, a practiced smile on his lips. "I heard," he said, as though the news had reached him like a business report instead of a life-changing event. Eleanor's posture stiffened, but she stayed silent. Natalie didn't rise from the bed. "She's sleeping," she said quietly, "so keep your voice down." Grant stepped closer, eyes flicking to the baby, his expression momentarily softening. "She looks like my mother," he murmured. "She looks like herself," Natalie corrected, "and she deserves peace. For that we'll need rules." She spoke calmly, almost professionally. "You'll have visitation according to court terms, you'll provide support, and you'll keep your drama out of her life. That's the deal." Grant blinked as though he'd expected pleading, not boundaries. "Nat, you don't have to be so cold." "I'm not cold," she said. "I'm focused." After he left, Eleanor exhaled heavily. "I raised him better," she said again. The same words she had spoken that awful night, but now they carried more sorrow than anger. Natalie reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're not responsible for who he chooses to be. You gave him the tools. He chose the weapon." Eleanor's eyes glistened, and for a moment both women sat in quiet understanding. Two mothers, two survivors of men who believed power meant possession. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and small victories. Natalie learned to read Maya's cries, to balance conference calls while rocking a bassinet with her foot, to function on 2 hours of rest and still smile when her daughter opened her tiny hands. The exhaustion was brutal, but it carried a strange beauty. Every night when the apartment fell silent except for Maya's soft breathing, Natalie would sit by the window and watch the city lights shimmer. "We're doing it," she would whisper. "We're really doing it." Her business kept growing, slowly, steadily, fueled by word of mouth and her sheer determination. Clients trusted her because she worked with heart, because her story had reshaped her into someone who understood resilience like a language. One afternoon, when Maya was 6 weeks old, the final custody hearing took place. Natalie dressed professionally, nerves simmering beneath the calm surface. She carried Maya into the courtroom herself, not to dramatize but to humanize, to remind everyone present that this was not about revenge, but about responsibility. Grant's lawyers argued predictably, claiming she was emotionally fragile, still recovering, too busy to manage a child and a company. Marcus dismantled every argument with precision. When the court psychologist testified that Grant displayed narcissistic traits and difficulty empathizing, Grant's face hardened. The judge listened, asked questions, and finally delivered a verdict that left the room hushed. "Primary physical custody to Miss Reed," he declared. "Supervised visitation for Mr. Whitmore until further review. Child support and college trust as previously negotiated." The sound of the gavel hitting wood was the sound of liberation. Natalie didn't celebrate, not outwardly. Instead, she looked at her daughter sleeping in her arms and whispered, "We're safe." Outside the courthouse, the reporters tried to shout questions, but Eleanor shielded her with a single glare that sent cameras lowering. In the car, Patricia reached from the front seat to brush Natalie's hair back. "You're free now," she said. "No," Natalie corrected softly. "We're finally beginning." The months that followed were filled with growth. Reed Marketing Consulting gained new contracts, and by spring she hired her first assistant. Her apartment became a symphony of baby laughter and business calls, of invoices and lullabies. There were moments of chaos, bottles spilling onto paperwork, deadlines colliding with diaper changes. But Natalie learned to dance with the madness instead of fighting it. Every challenge became proof that she could adapt, survive, and still find joy. One evening, as she rocked Maya to sleep, Eleanor visited again, carrying a box tied with a silver ribbon. Inside were photographs. Natalie at her baby shower, the hospital day, the custody hearing, the first time Maya smiled. "I've been documenting your comeback," Eleanor said softly. "You'll want to show her someday what strength looks like." Natalie looked through the photos, her throat tightening. "You know," she said, "I used to think strength meant pretending I wasn't hurt. Now I realize it's allowing yourself to feel everything, the pain, the fear, the love, and still choosing to stand." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's the kind of woman I always hoped my son would love. He was too small for you." Late that night, after everyone had gone home, Natalie sat by the window again, Maya asleep on her chest. The city glittered below, no longer a reminder of what she'd lost, but a symbol of what she had built. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, hopeful, naive, waiting for someone else to make her dreams real. That woman was gone. In her place stood a mother, an entrepreneur, a survivor. She had been broken open and rebuilt herself from the inside out. When the clock struck midnight, she whispered into the darkness, "Happy birthday, Maya." Then she paused, realizing something deeper. "Happy birthday to me too," she added quietly, because in giving birth to her daughter, she had also given birth to herself. The version of Natalie Reed who finally knew her worth, who no longer chased love to feel whole, who had turned betrayal into blueprint and heartbreak into power. The rise of her empire. The year that followed Maya's birth unfolded like a slow sunrise after a long, brutal night. It didn't happen all at once. Light came in fragments, warmth came in waves. But eventually the darkness faded, and Natalie found herself standing in a new version of her own life. Her apartment, once filled with echoes of loneliness, now pulsed with the sounds of laughter, baby giggles, and the quiet rhythm of growth. Every morning began before dawn when the city was still hushed and the world felt reset. She would hold a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and cradle Maya with the other, watching the sky shift from charcoal to gold. Those moments, soft and unhurried, were where she rebuilt her sense of peace, not through perfection, but through gratitude for simple, unremarkable calm. Reed Marketing Consulting had started as a survival move, a desperate act of independence, but it quickly transformed into something much greater. Clients began referring her work to others, impressed not just by her creativity but by her resilience. Corporations that once overlooked her in favor of larger agencies now sought her out, drawn to the quiet confidence that came from having survived what she had. By the time Maya turned 1, Natalie had hired 3 full-time employees and moved the business from her apartment into a small but sunlit office downtown. The walls were painted warm cream, the furniture simple and elegant, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the space every Monday morning. She insisted her employees take long lunches, work flexible hours, and never apologize for having lives outside of work. She had learned the hard way that burnout was just another kind of imprisonment, and she wanted this company to be the opposite, a place where women, especially mothers, could thrive without apology. One afternoon, she stood by the office window, looking down at the flow of city traffic. The world outside was busy, loud, unstoppable, yet inside her heart there was silence, not emptiness but contentment. She thought of who she used to be, the woman who had defined her worth through someone else's affection, who had bent herself to fit into someone else's story. That woman no longer existed. Natalie Reed now belonged wholly to herself. Her success wasn't fueled by revenge anymore. It was built on purpose. She no longer wanted to prove Grant wrong. She wanted to prove herself right. Still, the past had a way of knocking when least expected. One morning, as she walked into her office carrying Maya's diaper bag and her laptop, she saw a man waiting by the reception desk. It was Grant. He looked older, or maybe it was just that she now saw him without illusion. The charm that once drew her in now looked hollow, rehearsed. "You look good, Nat," he said with a faint smile. "You always did." She didn't bother to return it. "What do you want, Grant?" she asked evenly. "I'm not here to fight," he said, raising his hands. "I came to talk. I've been doing therapy, trying to fix myself. I know I made mistakes and a lot of them. I want to see Maya more. Maybe we can work something out outside of lawyers. For a moment, Natalie just looked at him, taking in the irony of it all. There had been a time when she would have given anything to hear those words. Now they carried no power. I'm glad you're trying to change, she said calmly. But Maya's stability comes first. You'll see her according to the agreement. Nothing less, nothing more. And if you really want to be better, you'll prove it by respecting boundaries, not by asking to break them. Grant's jaw tightened, but he nodded. You've changed, he said quietly. You're colder. No, she replied. I'm wiser. When he left, the office seemed brighter, lighter, as if his departure had taken with it the last residue of her old life. Eleanor called that evening, as if sensing the encounter through some invisible thread. He came to see me today, Eleanor said over the phone. Said he's trying to make amends. I told him the best apology is consistency. He didn't like that answer. Natalie smiled faintly. He never did handle accountability well. Eleanor's tone softened. You've built something remarkable, Natalie. Not just the business and yourself. I wish I'd learned as young as you did that independence isn't loneliness, it's freedom. Summer came and with it new opportunities. A major eco-brand offered Natalie's firm a nationwide contract, the kind of deal that could triple her company's size. It was the culmination of every long night and every risk she'd taken, but with success came pressure. There were more meetings, more travel, and the constant balancing act of being both mother and entrepreneur. Some days exhaustion clung to her bones like weight, yet when she walked into Maya's room and saw that little girl's smile, bright, innocent, trusting, all the fatigue melted. You're the reason I do this, Natalie would whisper at bedtime, so you'll never think you have to shrink for anyone. Patricia and Eleanor became her unshakable support system. They took turns helping with Maya, forming an unlikely friendship that filled the house with a strange, beautiful harmony. On weekends, they would all gather in Patricia's backyard, Maya toddling through the grass, Eleanor sipping iced tea, Patricia telling old stories while Natalie caught up on client calls. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was one built on love that didn't demand sacrifice. It was peace, pure and earned. But peace is often tested right when you begin to trust it. One late afternoon, Marcus, her lawyer, called her with a tone that immediately raised alarms. Grant's filed for joint custody, he said flatly. Natalie's breath caught. On what grounds? He's arguing improved circumstances. Therapy, stable lifestyle, volunteer work. It's not uncommon, but we'll need to prepare. For a brief moment, fear flickered again. The old haunting fear that Grant could still control her life. But it faded quickly, replaced by resolve. Then we'll prepare, she said firmly. And this time, I'll walk into that courtroom not as someone defending herself, but as someone defending her daughter's peace. The months that followed were grueling. Court hearings, evaluations, endless paperwork. But Natalie approached them with precision and calm. Grant did indeed appear changed on the surface, but the cracks showed in his impatience and his need to win. The judge, seasoned and observant, saw through the performance. Mr. Whitmore, he said during the final hearing. Change takes time, not declarations. Miss Reed has provided a stable, nurturing environment for your daughter. I see no reason to alter that structure. When the ruling came, reaffirming Natalie's primary custody, she felt no triumph, only relief. She didn't celebrate this victory. She simply accepted it as another confirmation of her path. After the hearing, Grant approached her outside, his tone quieter than ever before. You really don't need me at all, do you? He asked. Natalie looked at him for a long moment. I needed you once, she said softly. But I mistook needing help for needing someone. I've learned the difference now. He gave a small, bitter laugh. I hope she grows up like you. She will, Natalie said simply, but with better choices. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor like punctuation marks ending a chapter. Months later, Reed Marketing reached its first major milestone, $1 million in revenue. The team celebrated with laughter, champagne, and a quiet toast from Natalie. To building what no one can take away. The office lights glowed warm against the city's night, and as she looked around at the people who had believed in her, she realized she had finally achieved something far more lasting than wealth. Respect. Her story had begun with betrayal, but now it had become a blueprint for resilience. That night, after everyone left, she walked onto the office balcony and called Patricia. "Mom," she said softly, "I used to think love was supposed to feel like fireworks. Loud, dazzling, all-consuming. But now I think it's supposed to feel like this and steady, safe, quiet." Patricia smiled on the other end of the line. "That's not the end of your story, sweetheart. It's just the part where you finally found yourself." Natalie looked out at the skyline where the lights of 1,000 other lives shimmered. Somewhere her past still existed in photos and memories and lessons learned. But her future stood right here, alive in the pulse of her success, in the sound of Maya's laughter through the phone, in the peace that came from knowing she had built her life with her own hands. And as the city wind brushed against her hair, she whispered again the words that had carried her through every trial. "We're okay." No, not just okay. They were unstoppable. The legacy. She built 5 years later. The world around Natalie Reid looked entirely different. Though sometimes when she paused at red lights or walked past the glittering windows of the Whitmore Hotel, a flash of memory would remind her of how far she had come. The city that once felt like a battlefield had become her canvas. Reid Marketing Consulting had grown from a small office into a thriving firm, occupying the 12th floor of a glass tower downtown. The company employed 27 people, most of them women and young parents who had once been told that ambition and family could not coexist. Natalie built policies that protected them from the cruelty she had faced: on-site childcare, flexible hours, paid family leave, and a culture that rewarded integrity more than image. Every success story within those walls felt personal. Each promotion, each launch, each campaign victory was a quiet rebellion against the life she had escaped. Her mornings began earlier than ever. Maya, now 5, would crawl into her bed just before sunrise, her hair a tangle of golden curls, her voice soft and curious. "Mommy, are you going to work with your brave ladies again?" she would ask, and Natalie would smile, kissing her forehead. "Yes, but first we make breakfast for our queen," she would answer, placing a crown-shaped pancake on her daughter's plate. The routine was sacred. Breakfast, laughter, a few stolen minutes reading a picture book about explorers and inventors before the day demanded its tempo. Patricia, still vibrant and patient, watched Maya when work ran late, while Eleanor, now gentler in her age, visited every weekend to spoil her granddaughter with handmade dresses and stories about strong women who refused to live small. Between those two pillars, Natalie had built a home thick with love and calm, a place where there was no trace of the chaos that had once consumed her. But the world had not stopped watching her rise. Media outlets occasionally featured her story as an example of reinvention. Podcasts invited her to speak about entrepreneurship after trauma. Universities asked her to mentor students navigating ambition and identity. She never shared the full scandal that had started it all. She didn't need to. The headlines focused on what she had created, not on who had once tried to destroy her. When asked about failure, she would smile and say, "Failure is just the world rerouting you to something bigger." The audience would always applaud, not realizing how literal those words were for her. Grant's name rarely came up anymore. He had remarried a socialite from Chicago and lived mostly abroad. His visits with Maya were cordial, scheduled, safe. He sent gifts, wrote letters, and tried to remain present in ways that mattered more for public image than genuine affection. Natalie no longer felt anger, only distance, like looking at an old photograph of someone she used to know. Sometimes she caught glimpses of him at public events or charity galas. Their eyes would meet briefly, a silent acknowledgement that the story between them had ended long ago. Eleanor, ever diplomatic, maintained a quiet connection for Maya's sake but protected her daughter-in-law's boundaries fiercely. The once fractured Whitmore matriarch now referred to Natalie as the best decision my son never made. The greatest transformation, however, was internal. Natalie had learned that healing was not a straight line but a spiral that revisited the same pain with new wisdom each time. There were days when exhaustion crept back in, when the weight of responsibility felt heavier than she cared to admit. Yet unlike before, she never hid those moments. Her staff knew when she needed space. Her daughter knew that strong did not mean unbreakable. Vulnerability, she realized, was not weakness. It was the foundation of authentic strength. The more she embraced that truth, the more her company flourished. and the more peace settled into her bones. On the 5th anniversary of her business, Natalie organized a celebration in the same ballroom where her humiliation had once taken place. The decision wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming space. The hall was transformed, soft lighting, green plants, music that lifted rather than echoed. Her team mingled with clients. Maya darted between tables in her tiny satin dress, and Patricia and Eleanor stood side by side watching it all unfold. When Natalie took the stage to speak, the room quieted. She looked out over the crowd, her heart full. 5 years ago, she began, I thought my life had ended in a room like this. What I didn't understand was that endings are simply invitations to rewrite your story. Every woman, every person in this room has survived something they thought would break them. We are proof that broken does not mean ruined, it means rebuilt. The applause that followed was long, not for spectacle, but for recognition. People saw themselves in her words. For the first time, Natalie realized she wasn't just leading a business. She was leading a movement. Later that night, when the event had ended and the lights dimmed, she walked to the same spot on the ballroom floor where Grant had once knelt before another woman. She closed her eyes not to relive the moment but to bless it. Without that heartbreak, none of this would exist. She whispered to the empty room, "Thank you for breaking me open." The words weren't bitter, they were sacred, like closing a prayer. The following week brought another milestone. A national magazine published a feature titled, "The Women Who Redefined Success," with Natalie on the cover, holding Maya in her arms. The article celebrated her firm's ethical model and her advocacy for working mothers. She received thousands of messages from women across the world, teachers, nurses, entrepreneurs, thanking her for showing that survival and success could coexist. Reading those messages late one night, she realized she had become the woman she had once needed when she was broken. That, more than the awards or the revenue, was her true legacy. Years passed softly. Maya grew into a curious, fearless girl who asked hard questions and refused to accept easy answers. At 10, she told her mother she wanted to build houses for people who didn't have any. Natalie smiled, recognizing in her daughter the same fire that had once carried her through the darkest times. Together they volunteered at shelters and community projects, small acts that felt like ripples in a much larger tide. Every time Natalie looked at her daughter, she saw not a reminder of betrayal, but the embodiment of rebirth, proof that love, when rooted in truth, could heal generations. As Natalie entered her 40s, her company expanded internationally. With offices in London and Singapore, she stepped back from daily management to focus on mentorship and writing. Her first book, The Light That Came Through the Cracks, became a bestseller. Blending memoir and motivation, she donated half the proceeds to scholarships for single mothers returning to education. When asked during interviews how she found the courage to forgive, she always said, "Because carrying hate is like dragging a corpse, it weighs down the living." People often cried hearing her speak, but Natalie's tone remained calm, grounded, healed. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, she sat on her porch overlooking the Pacific, the air thick with salt and possibility. Patricia dozed in a chair beside her. Eleanor knitted something small and pink for an upcoming grandniece, and Maya, now 12, painted seashells at the table. The sun dipped low, scattering gold across the waves. Natalie sipped her tea and let the silence fill her. There was no more noise, no more need to prove anything. Her life had settled into a rhythm of purpose and peace. She thought about the girl she once was, the one in the emerald-lit restaurant, trembling, humiliated, betrayed, and she wished she could reach back through time and tell her, "Hold on. This pain will become your power. This ending will birth your empire." When the first stars appeared, Maya looked up and said, "Mommy, how do you know when a story is finished?" Natalie smiled, her heart swelling with quiet joy. "When you can tell it without hurting," she said. "That's when you know it's not your wound anymore. It's your wisdom." The ocean wind rustled through the palms, carrying her words away into the endless horizon, and Natalie realized that her story had indeed come full circle. Not the fairy tale she once imagined, but something far more beautiful. An odyssey of loss turned into legacy, of survival turned into strength, of love rediscovered not in someone else's arms, but in her own reflection and her daughter's laughter. As the night deepened, she rose from her chair, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and looked once more at the vast moonlit water. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that exists only after storms. She whispered, "We're more than okay, Maya. We're everything we were meant to be." And somewhere in the rhythm of the waves, it felt as if the universe whispered back in agreement.